Hello, everybody, and welcome to Behind the Camera. Here we are with episode 99 of Behind the Camera. We're coming to the end of the road to 100, and I think today's episode is definitely a great one to round us off before hitting the big 100. But before we get into today's show, if you would like to follow Behind the Camera across social media, you can find my link tree in the description. That will take you to Instagram, TikTok, X, YouTube, and also has the link to where you can buy my book, Behind the Camera, The Journey So Far. This is available in both paperback and ebook and is free to read if you have Kindle Unlimited. If you want to see more of the behind the scenes side of the podcast, you can also support the show on Patreon. For £3 a month, you'll get access to extra content, including a Patreon exclusive series, your name added to the wall of patrons at the end of every episode of Behind the Camera, and much more. But now, getting into today's conversation. Today, I'm joined by documentary filmmaker Alan Govenar. Following the recent release of his latest film, Quiet Voices in a Noisy World, we take a deep dive into the making of the project, from Alan's time in Jasper, witnessing history unfold, to building relationships with the local community, and what ultimately brought this powerful story to life. We explore themes like historical trauma, the importance of community in small towns, and why this film resonates so strongly with what's happening in the world today. But now, here's the interview. Alan, welcome to Behind the Camera podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you on the show. How are we doing?
Great. Delighted to be with you today.
Amazing. I love to hear that. Love to hear that. So, your news documentary, Quiet Voices in a Noisy World, just recently dropped on Amazon Prime Video, which, first of all, congratulations. But just for the sake of the listeners who may not have seen this yet, can you give us like a sort of brief overview in terms of what the documentary is about?
When I first went to Jasper, Texas in 1996, it was related to work I was doing with Documentary Arts, the organization I founded in 1985, and our Texas African American Photography Archive. We were one of the few independent archives supported by the National Archives in Washington. And the last phase of this 3.5 years of funding that we had was to do a regional archivist position, and where our archivist went into historically Black colleges in East Texas. And at that time, I was working with a professor, Lloyd Thompson, and his wife, Bertha, was a grade school teacher in Jasper, Texas. And she knew the widow photographer, Alonzo Jordan. And he was the town barber. He was an elder in the church. He was a strong community-oriented person, totally proactive. He was looked up to in his community. He had died in the 1980s. And after his death, his studio, which was in the barbershop, fell into disrepair. And shortly before I had gotten there, a hurricane had ripped the roof of this barbershop, and much of his collection was being ruined. So I met with his widow and with her goddaughter, and they donated about 6,500 photographs, negatives, and prints related to Alonzo's work over the course of his career, which was about 40 years. I had founded the Texas African American Photography Archive with artist Khalida Doolin in 1995. We were collecting the work of photographers, Black photographers especially, whose work was little known and not very well documented. Well, 2 years after getting this collection in 1998, there was the terrible lynching and dragging death of James Byrd Jr., which attracted international attention. And I continued to work in Jasper and with people in the Black community, and over the years did various exhibitions, the largest of which we did in New York in 2011, and that was video installation plus the work of Alonzo Jordan. I did a series of human-sized video portraits where people who knew him talked about his work. The premiere video in that was Mrs. Jordan, who appears in this movie. At the point, she was 95 years old and blind, and she was telling you what you were about to see. My work continued there, and there was a book published by the International Center of Photography and the German publisher Steidl on Alonzo Jordan. And I got an email from this group. It was the Alumni Association of the J.H. Rowe Schools, which were the segregated schools in Jasper, Texas. And they purchased 300 copies of my book. And at that time, we only knew probably the identities of about 5% of the people in the photographs. And they came back to me with a spreadsheet where 95% were identified. And I started to get to know the people who became the main subjects in the film, which is a group of men and women led by a community leader, George Adams, who grew up in Jasper, went into the Navy, came back, and they began to organize as a group of volunteers dedicated to reclaiming their history, dedicated to turning the corner on the trauma that this community had suffered. And so I continued to document these individuals and what had happened in Jasper. And I did a series of little short videos. And then I realized that about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, that this needed to be a bigger movie. Because everything that was going on in the United States today, the politics of erasure as it relates to racial identity and diversity, it started to take on a different significance. And as I saw this group of volunteers working tirelessly, building little museums, putting up roadside markers, organizing a scholarship fund for kids where they've given like $200,000 in scholarships to kids from this area who otherwise wouldn't have educational opportunities, I was truly impressed. And that's what became this film.
Yeah, of course. And that theme of community, especially within the Black community in Jasper, is something that's quite prominent within the film, through things like grassroots activism. One particular thing of note would be the J.H. Rowe Tigers Monument that was built. They put together the committee, and then they had the memorial for everybody who served in the war. Like I think that's absolutely incredible, because given the other themes, with the historical trauma and James Byrd, it really does kind of add to the topic of erasure, which is like, sort of big as it has ever been. And did you find that in Jasper this was particularly prominent than other places that you might have been, like the tight-knit community and really kind of sharing that hope and optimism of like a better and brighter future?
Well, over the years, I started documentary arts in 1985, but I'd been writing about different aspects of African American life, music, and culture. A big part of what I do is write books. I've published more than 40 books, and I've done probably 14 or 15 books related to different aspects of blues, jazz, African American art forms. This particular community distinguished itself in ways that resonated for me. I grew up myself in the 1950s in Dorchester, Massachusetts, where over the course of my childhood, there were increasing racial tensions. And fortunately, I had parents, particularly my father, who was socially progressive. He loved Black music. That introduced me to Black culture early on. What particularly interested me in seeing this becoming a film, I've made a dozen different movies that are available on Prime Video. But it needed to not only speak to what was happening locally in this community, but to bigger issues, because this kind of cultures in conflict and the trauma of cultures in conflict is a global issue. Certainly for you living in Northern Ireland, the legacy of what's happened there is hard. It's hard to turn that corner. And I'm sure you growing up in that world, it was always there. The lynching of James Byrd was always there. For me, some of the terrible things that happened in the Boston area have stuck with me. So it's a movie about, ultimately, there's some very difficult moments in this film, in that it looks deeply at the horror of what happened and what happened even before in this area of Texas. But it is a bigger metaphor.
Yeah.
It's a metaphor for me for hope, optimism, that we can turn these corners. And so much of what drives my work is my belief in the potential of a better world.
Absolutely. And, that's quite evident throughout the film as well, because you can tell in a lot of the interviews that, especially with what happened to James Byrd Jr., that will never, ever be forgotten. That is always going to be a massive part of Jasper. But there is this sense of like hope and optimism, and essentially bringing people closer together, like uniting people more to be like, let's not let anything like this happen again. Let's really kind of just work together and, aim for a brighter future for everybody, regardless of race.
Certainly. This film premiered theatrically in New York City in November at Cinema Village. And in thinking about where I wanted to premiere the movie in Texas, I chose Jasper because I still have associations with the people. And on March 7th this spring, we organized an event and film screening for the people in the Jasper community. And I really had no sense of how many or what kind of people would come.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, it was a mix of whites and blacks. There were 4 city council people. People thanked me for making the movie, for bringing this to the public. They felt this was so important in terms of their own healing as a community. In addition, documentary arts, we completed the conservation of the photographs that I got in 1996, and we gave back to this community a hard drive that has about 6,500 images. So for their use in their community.
That's incredible. And from your own personal experience, having spent, the guts of 30 years working in Jasper, what was your personal experience like there, sort of as everything kind of has been going on that's talked about in the documentary?
Well, I must say that when I first, after the lynching of James Byrd, it was a very difficult place to go.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a community at that time that was very divided. And when I did the book on Jasper, people in the Black community were reluctant to talk much about racism. The person who was the most vocal in my book was the district attorney who had prosecuted the cases against those 3 white men. And it was the first time in the history of Texas that anyone who is white was given the death penalty for killing somebody that's black.
Wow. Yeah.
And this had great magnitude. The district attorney was someone who was a 5th generation Jasper resident. And his father had been superintendent of the schools for Jasper. He's white. And his father had witnessed a lynching growing up and was powerless to do anything. So when I first went to Jasper after the lynching of James Byrd, I will say there was a sense of, the potential of looming danger.
Mhm.
And I was careful. Unfortunately, I had inroads into the community. I mean, there was, people in the African American community invited me in.
Yeah.
White people, some in that community, wondered what I was doing there. They weren't, and so the fact is that Jasper is located in a part of deep East Texas where there's a long history of Klan violence.
Yeah. And up until like a certain point, like say before you started making the documentary, was it very much a case of if you're not from Jasper, it was very like evident almost, like everybody kind of knew everybody around the town for sort of thing?
Well, I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
And I would, it's you're noticed in a little town. This is a town of about 6,000 people.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
I my plan. Usually, I park my car at the Holiday Inn Express, and people in the Black community picked me up and took me around town in their pickup truck.
Mhm. So was it just
People,
a matter of time after that where there was that kind of trust for you to really do the research and meet all these people to be able to make the documentary then?
well, people in the African American community that I was working with are activists.
Hmm.
They're people who are, fighting the good fight to get past this. And in deciding on a title for the film, Quiet Voices in a Noisy World, The Struggle for Change in Jasper, Texas, I told George Adams. George Adams, by the way, is the person who designed the Tiger Memorial and the Veteran of Foreign Wars Memorial and the museum. I mean, right now they're working on a facility for homeless and at-risk families. I mean, these are serious volunteers and serious activists. And so George was someone who was very closely involved in the movie, as were other people in the Black community. But I told George that, and I've been thinking about the title. He had veto power for me because this was his world. And we tried on different titles that he found he didn't really like, and he had to think about. And then finally, I came up with this idea of quiet voices in a noisy world. And he loved that title. He didn't have to think twice about it because they are quiet voices. Because within that community, while there were people that came from all over the world after the James Byrd lynching, a lot of people in that community didn't go out in public.
Yeah.
And consequently, an aspect of their world wasn't really documented in the international press. I mean, it was shocking to me that all the international press that happened after the James Byrd lynching, there wasn't a single photograph made by Alonzo Jordan that I ever saw published anywhere.
It's
So, it's complex
yeah.
because it became an inflection point, and it's even a bigger inflection point in a way in today's America.
For sure, for sure. Like I certainly think it's one of those things where when like a small town like that kind of gets that kind of international coverage, for example, then that's when like the erasure kind of starts to hit as well, because it's like these are small tight knit communities with like these with this activism, they just want a better life for everybody. But then as soon as like becomes international, then more people know about it, and it seems to get a little bit complicated, I find. And it really like it is evident, like because to go back to you know building the Jade Row Tigers, everybody who volunteered was based on, oh, I know this person, they do this, they handle bricks, they know how to do this, and that's kind of how these like part of the committee was formed, which I think is like incredible, and it made so simple as well, which I don't think you would get in other communities.
I think it's very remarkable.
Hmm.
And for me, it's certainly a national model of how to move forward.
Yeah.
It's a viable and sustainable one because it engages, it's multi-generational. It engages people on a lot of different levels, from the emotional to the intellectual. And I think that that's certainly our hope, that this movie can help others see this path, but also to help others recognize
Yeah.
the core human values that are expressed here.
I think so, yeah, because when you look at these things, like, you mentioned Northern Ireland, troubles in Northern Ireland, that's something that, like, is very much generational as well. A lot of people take more of an emotional stance to it, um, because of how their families were affected by it, and even though it's less of a thing today, it's there's a lot of people who still haven't really kind of progressed as much as others, and I'm trying to sound as neutral as possible while I say all this, just to avoid a firestorm, but that is just kind of the way. So I do think it's, like, important for other communities, other cities, countries to really kind of take note and look and just think, yeah, okay, these things have happened. What can we do together? Let's not let this divide us, because ultimately, like, everybody needs to be brought together. We're all humans at the end of the day.
Well, yes. I mean, because as you dip into these areas or go deeply into them, it becomes threatening to some people.
Mhm.
It's controversial. And part of this movie has that meta dimension because there are people who talk openly.
Yeah.
How far could we go in describing racial violence? And that's a big question. It's controversial not only in the African American world, but in the non African American world.
Yeah, of course, of course. So when it came to doing the interviews, what I liked about it is, you have, like, all your archival material, including, like, the music from the 1940s, and putting everything that you had together. Like, it really kind of adds to the authenticity of the documentary. So you touched on this about, you were meeting new people, interviewing people, and was it almost like a snowball effect in terms of you would have interviewed someone to be like, oh, I could introduce you to XYZ, and then so on and so forth?
It was all a word of mouth network.
Really?
It was uncanny, just to your point about the music, that these recordings done by John Lomax in 1940, that he recorded two people in Jasper, Texas. One of them, Billy McRae, was a former slave, and he was the common ancestor of many of the people I was making this movie about.
Yes.
And additionally, this was the time when Alonzo Jordan was beginning his career as a photographer, photographing not just people in Jasper, because this area is so isolated. I mean, he photographed people within a 70-mile radius of where he lived. But then there was also the work of the white photographer, Russell Lee, who was also photographing East Texas at that time. So it provided a unique opportunity to see this world, this diaspora, from more than one vantage point. The white photographer, the recordings from 1940, the work of Alonzo Jordan, and how does that resonate and how does that carry forth into the present?
Mhm. Absolutely. And it is one of those things that is, like, always remembered within the communities. And but if you look at that, that's, like, such a significant piece of history right there, that I don't think a lot of people would really realize until they watch the documentary, like, how much of a rich history, especially within the African American community, that Jasper has itself. And do you feel like these sorts of things are, like, underrepresented in, like, wider media? And, like, this, obviously, like, with your documentaries and things, like, this can, like, help bring it out.
Yes, I mean, I've, over the course of my career, focused on those areas
Mm-hmm.
of art, culture, and history. as it relates to contemporary issues. But yes, I've spent a lifetime documenting and writing about the marginalized, the overlooked. And that permeates my nonfiction work. I've also written novels. And this last year, the same year that this movie was released, actually in 2025, there was a new novel of mine called Come Round Right, which is a paean to the end of the 1960s. And it is also about trauma, sexual violence. And there are two nonfiction books of mine that came out last year on the subject of tattooing. There were two exhibitions. One, there was an exhibition, Kinship and Community, selections from the Texas African American Photography Archive, that was curated by Nicole Fleetwood, and a book was published by Aperture Foundation by that title. And that exhibition was at the Center for Photography at Woodstock, outside of New York City. Wow. And there was also another exhibition that was called Everyday Culture, 7 projects of documentary arts. It was a kind of 40-year survey of my work in different areas. So these are issues that continue to intrigue me.
Yeah.
In different forms. I also work in theater and musical theater. So for me, the subjects that I choose to focus on, it's the subject that determines for me the medium. Sometimes that's a poem. Sometimes it's a story. Sometimes it becomes a play.
Yeah.
Or a movie.
Yeah. And that's really interesting, because I was about to ask about, your method of storytelling, but like I pretty much just answered it. It's like how well each topic can fit into a story in the medium. But does it ever, so you mentioned how you were making short videos then for Quiet Voices in the Noisy World, and then it kind of ended up as a long form documentary for that reason, because it's better suited the story. Have you ever found that with writing a book, like fiction or nonfiction, that maybe get so far through and think, okay, maybe this could be better on a screen? Or is it always just just from experience what medium is best?
I started my first novel when I was 18. But I will honestly say I didn't know it was going to be a novel. And it's based on true events that I experienced, and set in the fall of 1970 and the spring of 1971. It's about hitchhiking, and something terrible happens. And I spent a lot of years ruminating how to do it.
Yeah.
I never felt like I wanted to, it was never going to become a memoir, because there was elements of it in the fiction that in many ways made it feel more truthful, more real, by creating situations.
Yeah.
And so that was a poem. It became a longer poem. It became a short story. And then I met someone, I'm a member of what's called the Texas Institute of Letters, a writer by the name of Kathy Appelt, and we were on a trip to Cuba. And I was telling her about this book, and she wanted to read it. And Kathy really helped a great deal for helping me to shape it into a novel and to see how it could become a novel. And from her point of view, the more it became fiction, the more true it became. And she helped catalyze that. So that was a book I started, and it was published, more than 52 years later.
Yeah.
So there are lots of through threads in my work. And so it's not unusual that I start working in one medium. In the 1980s, I did a lot of radio work, and I traveled around Texas and around the United States recording folk and traditional music and focusing on folk artists. And the people I met along the way, it was a series of conversations, became little radio features. Some of them became books. There's one woman who I documented, Osceola Mays, who was also from East Texas. And at that time, I was organizing these free public folk festivals. And I met her through a member of her church. And she sang a cappella spirituals. And when I met her, she said, but it's not correct singing. And I said, not correct singing. She said, well, yes, it's the singing. It's not the way people sing spirituals now. It's the way my grandmother, Laura Walker, who was a slave, who died in her 90s. This is what she sang. This is what she learned to sing as a child. And Osceola was featured at this festival. I ended up doing a radio show about her. I did a movie about her. I made an artist's book about her that's on handmade paper. I released a DVD movie about her, and she became the subject of a stage show long after she was deceased. It's called Texas in Paris. That was based on a series of public programs. It was a stage show that was in Paris in 1989, ran for 3 weeks. It was in Florence, Italy as well. And flash forward 25 years later, it became an off-Broadway show that critically did well. It starred a Tony Award winner, Lillias White. And right now, we're getting ready for a new production of that is in January 27. So it's another one of these projects that have had these kind of circuitous route,
Yeah.
and taken different forms. And so for me, the experiences I have in life help me to shape the forms that I want to explore. But that's a discovery. It's not always planned. And sometimes it leads in directions that I don't anticipate.
Yeah. I think that's the beautiful thing about storytelling, though. When you hear somebody's story, like, I mean, I know personally from doing this is like my thoughts anyway. Like, I hear somebody's story and I'm like, this would make a great book. It would make a great podcast episode. It would make something just, it'd be great for this to be out in the world in whatever medium possible. And what I like about that is that the story you heard, it fits everything. And it's just, and sometimes that is just the way. And I think that's like the beautiful thing about storytelling. Like, every single person has a story. And, when you hear that, you really kind of gain that kind of perspective on other people's experiences. And especially, to link it back to Quiet Voices in a Noisy World, like, who would have ever have known, who's not seen it, like, what life was like for everybody in the documentary, like going back from a historical level to today to looking forward. And like, I think it really encapsulates like the power of storytelling for sure. But I just wanted to sort of touch back on something you said about writing your first novel, not knowing it was going to become a novel. And that's something that, as I haven't interviewed a number of authors before, it's something I've heard a lot, and it always intrigues me. It fascinates me because a lot of the time people are just writing. Obviously, you were writing about a particular experience that you had, but going forward into other fictional works, did this kind of help you find your sort of voice in fiction, as well as being able to sort of separate that from nonfiction, because ultimately they are two incredibly different writing styles.
Well, they are, but in my life, they've been concurrent.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, for me, regardless, most of my books are nonfiction. However, I work on poetry every day. I write poems every day. I've been doing it for years. And they're not always finished, and they take different shapes and forms as I go along. But it's, I have a rhythm to my day, and I like closing my day by writing poems. And so I very much am attuned to the what you're saying, because one has to understand what's the line between fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, I think it's a porous line. I think they seep into each other. And one of the documentary arts has a number of websites. One is documentaryarts.org. Another is mastersoftraditionalarts.org, which is 35 years of the work that I did focusing on these National Heritage Fellows traveling around the United States. There's thousands of photos, more than 500 little short movies on that website. One of our most recent endeavors is called truthinphotography.org. And we developed this in association with the International Center of Photography in New York, Magnum Photos, and Aperture. And we published the work. It's an online magazine. We were doing it 4 times a year. Now we're just doing it a couple of times a year. But we feature the work of everyone from high school photographers to some of the most famous photographers, exploring these issues of truth and image making, which have become critical. Now we live in this AI inundated world. What is truth in photography anymore?
Yeah. that is so true. And like it is scary, the use of AI, especially in photography, because I think it takes away the authenticity of it. When people are, it tells less of a story now, I think, than what it used to.
Well, it certainly is different.
Yeah.
However, we depend on the photographic record. That's our visual history. And the sad part of all this is that through the politics of erasure, certain kinds of photographic imagery are being buried. Shouldn't be looking at this. It's so much of what I have fought against is this rosy colored view of reality and history.
Yeah. Like it is a shame, because how is anybody meant to move forward then? How is anybody meant to move forward if these things if we're being made to pretend like these things never happened, essentially?
Well, when people are put at risk, truly. I mean, the way in which, they're trying to limit, the kind of photographs that are made related to these different conflicts in Gaza, in Iran, in Lebanon, and other places. But there's nothing new about this. This was the way it was during the Iraq War. This is, the playbook of authoritarian governments. This is what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, in Truth in Photography, we have focused on a Ukrainian photographer, Maxim Dundyuk, who in his portfolios of the beginnings of what was going on in Ukraine and the atrocities that were being committed, we were publishing images that mainstream media would not publish. And Maxime was someone who, as an independent photojournalist, his photographs were the cover of Time magazine in the United States. They were the cover of Der Spiegel in Germany, Geo. And his work was very powerful, but as time went on, we did 3 features on him. He's no longer a photojournalist because his access to what he wanted to photograph was becoming more limited. And it's difficult, that it's never simple. We just did a feature on a Ukrainian photographer who is a press officer who lives about 40 miles from the front line in eastern Ukraine. And he creates photographs, which he says some people might think of as propaganda. But if you look at them from a different vantage point, they're photographs that embolden people.
Yeah.
That's about their human dignity. And if you live there, if you live in an environment where people are constantly threatening your dignity and livelihood, what's the imagery that you want to see? And so it's very complicated. It's not easy. Even in the United States, with some of these Black photographers, there were not lots of photographs of racial violence that appeared in Black newspapers for obvious reasons, which is because these Black newspapers during the civil rights era were to embolden people, restore their self-esteem, focus on the normalcy of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a shame because it's like these people are having their voices taken away by being told what they can and can't photograph, what can and can't be published. But it really just, when you take that away from somebody, it just doesn't give the full idea of what's going on, especially, when you live somewhere where you don't have to worry on a day-to-day basis about the worst things possible happening to you. And then you do have these people, like you say, who live near the front line. That's what they experience every single day, is like completely different to what the likes of yourself and myself would experience on a daily basis.
Well, and it's obviously very relevant to your world, to Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that there's a very strong comparison there.
For sure, for sure. Like as safe as it is here these days, it's certainly like remembered heavily. Like, you'll go to certain places and there are a lot of murals. There'll probably be like it's a lot of murals, and it's at the point now, like a lot of them, they're just like part of, like, they're historical at this point now. Like, some of them were maybe done in remembrance or maybe like in protest or something like that. But yeah, it's very much a sort of, if you see certain things, you know what type of area you're in. And but again, it's sort of, for here, it's like, as long as you don't step on the wrong people's toes, you'll be fine.
Well, I think that there are many places like that.
For sure. For sure.
And I think that establishing a network of communication among like-minded people is very important. I've never been a paid full-time executive director of my own organization. Everything is project driven. And I think of documentary arts as a loosely connected network of like-minded people.
Oh,
And I've worked a
absolutely.
lot internationally. I've worked in Africa. I've worked in other places, Mexico.
Well, absolutely,
Yeah.
because when you're, if you want to document somebody, and you're interviewing people, these are people who want to be heard. These are people who either want to share their story, their experiences, or they believe in what it is that you want to document, to make a documentary about. Because like we go back, like, certain things are just completely underrepresented, and that's all it takes, is for the right voices to be heard at the right time.
And fortunately, there's more avenues for these films getting out there.
Yeah.
I'm a very strong independent. And one of my mentors in filmmaking, Les Blank, who shot my first film, and we made another short film together. He was one of the pioneers in the indie film world in the United States. And he did a lot internationally.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the world is a big place, and there's a lot of voices to be heard. But Alan, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on Behind the Camera podcast. Thank you so much for your time and for all your insights. And it's been amazing talking about quiet voices in a noisy world. Just before we wrap up, just for the sake of the listeners, I know you touched on this before, but if you would just like to share where we can find your work, just all in one place, and yeah, then we're good to go.
The biggest website that we have is called documentaryarts.org, and that has links to other websites. Quiet Voices in the Noisy World.org has some specific information about this film, but we have websites for several of our feature-length documentaries. And I have probably 24 films that are on Amazon Prime, and you can find out about my more than 40 books on Amazon, and other sites.
Yeah, amazing stuff. So yes, for those who are listening, make sure you do check out Alan's work, his films, his books. Amazing, especially Quiet Voices in a Noisy World, which only just recently released on Prime Video. It's incredible. Once again, Alan, thank you so much for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much.
And there you have it for episode 99 of Behind the Camera. Huge thank you to Alan Govenar for being today's guest, and be sure to check out Quiet Voices in a Noisy World. It's such a powerful documentary, and I would highly recommend it to anybody. As always, thank you to all patrons for your support. Paid or followed, you are appreciated. And of course, if you would like to stay connected with Behind the Camera, check out my link tree in the description for all socials and my book, Behind the Camera, The Journey So Far, which is out now. Thank you for listening, for the support, and for being part of the journey. Until next time, take care, stay creative, and I'll see you soon. But until then, peace.